Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking again with Eric Kaufmann. Eric is a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham. He's also an author. A couple of his books are White Shift and Taboo, and then his latest one is The Third Awokening, um, a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism, which I'm glad to see more and more. Helen Pluckrose has put out the Counterweight Handbook, which is more for, I guess, on a personal level, and this is more for um, on a systemic level, if I can say it that way. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I know it's. I'm glad to see books like this are coming out, and you're also now teaching a course online on like the origins of woke, basically the ideology behind it. Is that correct, or is that like, or is
Yeah,
there
it's
more to
it's
that?
it's really about the origins, the social dynamics of woke, and then the politics of the culture war, and then looking at some of the philosophical questions around, what are woke values? What are the critiques of those values? What's the philosophical case for woke values? So that's sort of the broad spectrum of the course in
Okay,
15 weeks. Yeah.
all right, and because I was looking at it, and so what you can sign up at any point for this, right? It's not like it's
Yeah, it's an open online course that anyone can sign up to. And if you could, if you just Google, well, I'm just trying the University of Buckingham woke, Eric Kaufmann, then you should get it. um, yeah.
no, it's just because like I said, I was reading up on. Well, first of all, again, like I said, thank you for coming back on. But your book, I just finished reading it last week, and
Great.
like I said, I'm really glad it came out. I think we're well past the point where we really need to start pushing back. Like there was a lot of work done by a lot of people. Specifically, I'd say like James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian to kind of expose this stuff. It was only recently that I just saw that okay, people are starting to push back on it. But I wanted to touch on like something you said in like the introduction to your book because it's been something we've been saying for a while. Whenever I hear peak woke or oh look, it's it's receding, I keep thinking of George W. Bush on that you know aircraft carrier or destroyer or whatever it was in Iraq with like the mission accomplished, and I'm like no, you know like I'll concede that we might have peak awareness, but we're nowhere. I don't like. I don't think we're anywhere near it receding at all.
I agree. I agree.
No, but
Yeah. But you can sort of see this in different ways. I mean, I think you can say that there was this big swell, which is kind of the direction of the culture. And then on that swell, we have little wavelets. And we've just been to the top of one of those little wavelets on this big swell. And that was 2021, maybe. And we've kind of come down a bit from that. But the swell is still rising, and that's sort of the way I would put it, is that the direction of the culture is still moving in this way. It's just that we've had a short-term emotional enthusiasm wave of a few years has peaked and come down a certain amount.
yeah, I mean, okay, like that's a really good way of describing it because one of my one of my things with it is in Canada last year in September they had this thing called the Million March for Kids, which was pushing back against the transgenderism in schools. And then you had a bunch of kids who were stomping on pride flags, and you had some rumblings from Gen Z, then like whatever the next generation, Gen Alpha or whatever, about how they're
Right.
pushing back against this. And a lot of people were saying, "Oh, see, the kids are looking good," but then there was a couple of surveys that came out with those same generations. Gen Alpha and both Gen Z and Gen Alpha were saying they wanted more government supervision and more monitoring, even though, okay, yes, they were pushing back against gender queer theory, they still had an authoritarian bent. my biggest concern, like, and even before I knew what woke was or any of that stuff was, when I first came back, was I looked at it and I said, I saw what was going on from the left, and I said, we're gonna have overcorrections. And lately, I've been kind of stealing a page from Hitchens' book and talking about a man for all seasons. And I said, like, the woke were like Roper and a man for all seasons. They burned down all the laws, and now when you're having overcorrections, you don't have the institutions there left to protect you. And that's, like, I don't want to focus on I don't want to lose focus on what the woke left are doing, but I also want to keep an eye out for what's coming, because we no longer have the institutions that protected our civil liberties anymore, at least not in North America anyways. I don't know what it's like in the UK.
Well, boy, I mean, yeah, I'm not so this overcorrection, I'm really not. People will warn about that, but I haven't really seen, in my eyes, very many examples. There is a bit of that in some of the US red states where they have, for example, tried to abolish tenure for academics, or they've tried to ban the teaching of certain things at university. Whereas I think banning critical race and gender theory in schools is absolutely within the right of a democracy to do that, and I would support that. But I don't think doing that in a university where people have academic freedom is fine. Yeah, so I'm not as worried about an overcorrection, but what I would say is I don't think that the woke forces have really been damaged very much. Now, they've been damaged more in the US case because you have red states that have been willing to, get involved in critical race theory bans, in abolishing DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in universities. Now, the compliance level with that is it depends. But in Canada, there's absolutely no
Oh,
pushback, as far as I can tell.
oh, not at all. And in Canada, they just announced a new anti-racism thing, and what was it? I'd have to find the link, but they said, like, what precipitated it was George Floyd, the graves of the the residential
That's
school
great
children,
things. Yeah,
yeah,
right.
and BLM. So I mean, you're pushing this. The mass graves is an out and out lie, right?
Yeah. The
There are
hoax.
no,
It's an
yeah,
absolute hoax. Yeah,
okay.
that's
So
right.
the government's still pushing that. BLM, I mean, they should be a completely discredited organization by now. They're, you know, again, built on a lie. And yeah, George Floyd, that was horrific, and the cop is in prison, and whatever. If you want to go for police reform, I'm right there with you. But that was an American thing, has nothing to do with Canada, and yet our government is spending millions, and this is their rationale for why they need to spend all these millions.
So yeah, I mean, I think we need to take actually a step back, however, and understand this the bigger set of ideas, the water we're swimming in. In the West, Canada's one of the more extreme cases of this, and that water is what I call left liberalism, which is the dominant ideology in our society, and it's been an ideology that's been going for about 120 years, but it's been accelerating since the late 1960s. And what left liberalism is it's a bit like it's a fusion of liberalism and leftism. Now, on economics, it works really well. We have a mixed capitalist welfare state economy, but it's still capitalist. It's not command and control communist. Now, the tax and spend may be a bit too high for some people or a bit too low for other people, but it kind of oscillates within a certain band. And I'm not actually that worried about economics. But what I think is going on in the culture for left liberalism is there are no boundaries to more and more and more egalitarianism. So this is what I call cultural socialism. We would never say every individual in Canada should have exactly the same income and wealth. We, however, do say, and left liberals, this is not the cultural Marxist types that Chris Rufo and James Lindsay talk about, but I'm just even talking about these bleeding heart left liberals whose view of the world is you can never have too much equality between men and women, and in terms of outcomes, not in terms of equal treatment, but in terms of outcomes, prestigious jobs, for example, university grants, whatever the good is, it must be exactly equal. And if it's less than equal, between racial groups, between men and women, then there's a problem of systemic racism or patriarchy or sexism. That is the way they see the world. And so there's not much difference there. There's not much of a difference between the revolutionary Marxist march through the institutions, overthrow systemic systems of oppression worldview, and the left liberal, we need more diversity and equity. We need to be nicer and gentler and kinder. And by the way, majorities are really scary and will get us women back in the home and gays in the closet and black people back to Jim Crow. So what I see is this kind of fusion of these two ideologies. And Canada is really at the apex of that ideology, which has decades behind it.
Oh yeah, no, okay, Canada's got a lot behind it. You know, we've always been the quote unquote nice and polite and all that, but yeah, it's got decades behind it. And I mean, like the social Marxism or you know cultural Marxism or whatever. I mean, I try to veer away from those debates. I've spoken with people who were from like Isabella Tarabov. I can never pronounce her last name, Tarabovsky. She's from the Soviet Union. She grew up. Spoken with her, spoken with other people who are from there, and uh, the similarities and speaking people who were under Mao and like the similarities there. The only thing I concede kind of there is I just say it's not because I don't see the like the oppressor oppressed. I agree with all that. It's got those similarities, um, but I think that's a thing of totalitarian ideologies. They all kind of share it. If you look at Islam when it's at its most you know when it's at its most strident and its most authoritarian, it has those same things. Um, and so like that's why like but I just the way I kind of described it was instead of controlling the means of production, you want to control the means of production of the culture, and you want to change the shift that way. So when you mention things like DEI dying out in the US at universities, we don't need these DEI statements for hiring or for promotions or for admitting to students to classes or anything. Fine, but I think part of that also is they think that the base is being laid enough in K through 12 that you're already going to have people coming in, and the people coming out of uh, colleges of education or people coming out of humanities courses have already imbibed enough of this so that when they come in, they don't need to take that oath because they're already on board.
Right. Oh, no, absolutely. Now it's the case that students are coming out of school completely immersed in this stuff and in many cases indoctrinated, although, you know, the internet is a counterweight in many
Mm.
cases, at least certain more for younger men than for younger women. But the dominant culture that they're getting in the school system and the ethos is this left liberalism, extreme left liberalism on the culture side, and I guess what I'd call woke cultural socialism, which is just for your listeners, woke I define as the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. Out of that arises a sort of fuzzy set of moral intuitions, with Jonathan Haidt also talks about the equality and care harm dimension. On the equality dimension, against equal outcomes, care harm dimension, it is emotional harm protection for these historically marginalized groups, which have been made sacred. And if you transgress by saying anything that might be construed as offensive to one of these groups, you are canceled or excommunicated. And that's really where we are. And that's been sort of drummed into them in many cases. Now, I've got survey data on Britain and the US and how many of the 18 to 20-year-olds have heard critical race and gender theory concepts in the schools. In the US case, 90% of the 18 to 20s that I surveyed, 1,500 in the survey, had heard at least one critical race theory concept. That's unconscious bias, white privilege, and systemic racism from an adult in the school. So the saturation level of this stuff is really great. It's not just a few schools, and then first they said they weren't teaching it, then they admitted that it was being taught, but that it wasn't so bad. This is where we are. So indoctrination in the schools really is one of the things that I think needs to come as a top priority for conservatives. That reforming of the public school system, getting them to a point of political neutrality. has to be a crusade. You're going to have to take on the teachers' unions, the educational establishment, have that fight, and the public will be behind you.
Yeah, okay, Canada, I mean, we're starting to wake up. There's some organizations forming, and like I said, you had that march
Yeah.
against the transgender stuff. So it is slowly starting to build up here. But when I start thinking about Canada, how far we've gone, and I don't want to digress on this. I'd rather talk about your book, but it's just, I get depressed. I mean, if that new speech law, Bill 63 passes, I'm leaving. I'm not staying in a country where I can be arrested for a hate crime that they think I might commit. So
Right.
like Canada's gotten, you know, our government's not letting up. I don't know if we can last until next year for an election if at the rate they're going with this stuff. But I'm going to talk about people who are roughly my age, you know, who still get the news from like regular sources like mainstream media, and they're more on Facebook than anything else. And we can't share, news stories on Facebook. And it's,
Right.
like it's so we're keeping a large chunk of our population ignorant, and the government's doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So, yeah, like I said, I think it's like a warning sign for a lot of countries, like just careful what you're getting into. Um, but I want to actually get back to your book because I, you know, I think it's something that people, especially if you're in the, if you're struggling with this, or if you want to, hey, what do I need to get done, or what levels of, what is it exactly I'm looking at? Like people who are in this struggle should read it. Um, but yeah, like how, so, I mean, I'm assuming I know your impetus, but like, what made you decide to write that instead of just like another history of what woke was or anything like that, or something like Chris Refu just recently did?
Well, because I think that there are very few books. Now, there are a lot of books on the different aspects of woke, how it originated now. And Yasha Monk and Francis Fukuyama and James Lindsay and Chris Rufo and have written about this. Now, there's very few books, however, that propose any real policy solutions. I mean, there are a few policy solutions, but if you take a lot of the books, I mean, there's two different categories. One is to say classical liberal authors, the Greg Lukianoff, for example, Yasha Monk, even Helen Pluckrose to some degree. I mean, they would place a lot of the emphasis on kind of moral exhortation, unleashing people's inner courage. I think that's great, but I just don't think that's really how social change tends to happen, or at least I don't think that's really going to move the needle for the reform. Now, we have two problems. I mean, one is the long-term problem of the culture war and battle of ideas. And there, I think persuasion is absolutely essential. And so it's got a role to play. But in terms of relief to people who are feeling under pressure, feeling that they can't speak their minds, they don't have free speech, we don't have a truth-based order. I mean, Canada's probably the worst for that. You can't say something true, such as there are no mass graves, there was no genocide. You can't sort of tell the truth publicly, and you have to lie on things like DEI statements. So we have a problem with these things, and so to relieve the immediate current pressure. So we have the long-term problem of the culture, but we have the shorter-term problem of how do we get the institutions to reflect what is actually, in public opinion, still a 2-to-1 anti-woke position across 50 issues that I polled on. So the Canadian public is actually not woke, but the institutions are incredibly woke. How do we kind of get the air pressure in the institutions to reflect the air pressure outside? That is going to require political solutions. This is where you would need to have a conservative party, say provincially, or federally, that was willing to go after institutions like schools and universities and the civil service, and museums and all of it, and to sort of compel them to be politically neutral. That is a political project. There's been a lot of timidity, obviously, in Canada. Some provinces, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, are starting to do a bit, Alberta a bit. but it's still pretty early. Whereas in the U.S. red states, they are very much in the lead on this, getting rid of DEI, getting rid of ESG, environmental and social governance. So I think there is pushback. It's not all doom and gloom, but I think we very much have to look at these policy solutions, and policies can change the culture. And I'll give you a recent example is, you know, red states in the United States started to abolish diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, abolish diversity statement requirements for job applications. Then we had the heads of Harvard, MIT, and Penn hauled into a congressional committee and essentially raked over the coals by Republicans. Oh, well, all of a sudden now we see Harvard has abolished, they're no longer requiring diversity statements. MIT is no longer requiring diversity statements. Now they're doing that because they're under political pressure. But you know what? If they do that, maybe that's going to cascade down and change the culture at other American universities. And that's what I mean. Sometimes culture is downstream of politics.
Hey, no, look, I agree with you 100%. I don't think you can get this done without legislation, but I think you have to be careful with that legislation. Um, I think some couple of things we might disagree on. Like, I said this to, you mentioned Greg Lukianoff. I said this to him. I said, I don't care if a university has a chair in alchemy. They want to have a chair in alchemy, have a chair in alchemy. But the alchemy department cannot then go into the chemistry department or any other science departments and tell them how to do science. So if the University of Chicago wants to have a chair in CRT, go ahead, go right ahead. But then that department cannot come down to the physics department or any other department and tell them that they're not doing physics correctly because of racism. Or, like it's, the university should audit these courses and say, fine, you want to have that chair, we'll, fund it yourself, do whatever you want. We're not going to hand out degrees in a program that doesn't that can't prove its scholarship. Like the universities need to do that.
Well, I think there's a couple of things there. One is I unfortunately think you underestimate the sympathy within the academy, and not just in the crazy places, not just in the grievance studies disciplines. Academics, by almost 2 to 1, support mandatory diversity statements. More of them would support mandatory race and gender quotas on reading lists than would oppose it, 50% more. So the problem you'll get is you'll have the LGBT affinity group member in the physics department, the feminist even in the hard sciences in the engineering department, and they'll make a noise and the department will fold tent. So you don't even have to have somebody coming in, some other department coming in and imposing this. There is a lot of bottom-up conformity. So it's what I call emergent authoritarianism, certain activists putting pressure on the institution, and also peer pressure on their fellow academics who, and by the way, those fellow academics are often quite receptive because they believe that the highest values are equality of outcome and emotional harm protection for minorities. That's their North Star ethically. Now, they may not believe in canceling and firing people, but they roughly believe in the same values. So they'll go for diversity statements. They will go for decolonizing the curriculum. They'll go for a lot of this stuff in the name of, how can I be against equity? How can I be against diversity? How can I be against inclusion? Of course, I'm for those things. And so I think these things have a momentum that is not really about authoritarianism. And I guess I actually think there's a problem with the more libertarian style of that somehow the market and libertarianism will fix this. I actually think it won't, and it might actually make it worse, actually, because I like to say, there's 3 levels in society. You've got government, institutions, citizen. Now, yes, government can oppress the citizens if you're in China, if you're in I don't know, Turkey, Iran. Government is the biggest threat to liberty. But equally, institutions in the middle can oppress the citizens. They can fire you for speech so that you shut up. They can force you to sign statements you don't believe in. They can debank you, not allow you to have a bank account. There's all kinds of things that and I actually think a lot of what woke cultural socialism is being driven by institutions, and that's where that private censorship level, that's where the threat I think is coming from now Canada. You also have threats coming from the federal government, but sometimes if you elect a government that can act against those institutions to curtail their power and remove power from, the civil service, schools, universities, and the power to censor, to remove the power to censor, I think that's important. Now, you can always say, yes, well, what if you get another government in that is different and will then be bad? Well, that's fine, but it's very hard to imagine things being a lot worse than they already are. These institutions are a law unto themselves, and they're doing what they want. They're censoring. That has to be curtailed, and it can be curtailed because elected government is the only institution that the majority of the population can still control.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I agree with you there. The institutions have to be, um, you know, there has to be some checks and balances on them because they're going a little too far. I've spoken to some parent groups out in Canada and I've told them that straight out. I said, don't look for anyone to come here and save you. So, yes, you might get a government that comes in and puts the brakes on this stuff, but the long march through the institutions, it's taking a victory lap right now. So you've got a few generations worth of insanity to push back. And I mean, I tell them I'm being a realist and I don't want to, I'm not trying to scare anyone, but I think you're going to need a generation or two to completely turn this ship around because I think the institutions are so badly corrupted. I mean, I joke around like there's not enough barista jobs. If you got a government that came in and like removed everyone who's woke from the civil servant, so there's not enough barista jobs in the world for them all. Like,
Right.
and I'm sorry, but someone with a degree in gender studies is not fit for any purpose. And it's, like there's a lot to fix. You need to fix the universities, you need to fix the colleges of education, you need to fix K through 12. You know, there's a lot that needs to be done. And I don't want to scare people, but I want them to be realistic about what you're taking on. And like it's an uphill fight that you've like I said, I think it's going to take a generation or two
I
before.
think you're right. I think you're completely right. Now, there's a couple of, I'll try and be optimistic here.
Mm.
One of the things I did a little experiment where we just showed undergraduates, so 18 to 21s, just one paragraph about the fight. This is British undergraduates, paragraph about the fight for freedom of speech, the history of that, the importance of that. Then we had a paragraph about the importance of sort of so-called social justice and clamping down on speech in order to protect minorities. Now, what you saw was that in this student group, opinions were actually quite movable. Even by reading a paragraph, you got up to 15, 20 points of movement. What I would say is that up until they're about 20 or 21, if we intervene sharp and hard, I think we can make an impact. Now, are the teachers, it's teacher. I think we're always talking about a small number of these teachers that are a real problem, and the schools, the principals. But a real sort of attempt to reform the schools intensively in the inspection regime, reports to Parliament, ratings of politicians by how well they're doing on schools, really chilling the teaching establishment and preventing them from indoctrinating. Maybe bringing in outsiders and outside curriculum materials that are compulsory and taught by certain groups. But a mix of these policies to try and get the indoctrination out of the schools. I think that is, now if you had somebody who was really had the bit between the teeth like Ron DeSantis, who really understood the problem, who was willing to go into the policy detail, get rid of all the wiggle room, some heads are going to have to roll, people are going to have to be fired, open up the teaching profession to people who, so you don't require a university degree. All kinds of reforms are possible, I think. Similar on universities, there's a different set of things that I would bring in. UK has the new Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which I've been involved in. Developing the white paper, which then became the bill. So I think there's a lot we can do in terms of government action, but it has to become a priority for conservative parties, and they have to be rated. Their feet have to be kept to the fire by the grassroots so that they don't deviate. Much the way that in the US, I mean, I'm not a big fan of the gun lobby and the pro-life lobby, but they do a very good job between elections of making sure that congressmen do their bidding. We need something like that for the fight against equity, diversity, and inclusion policy, and all of that regime. And I think if we have to get the politics right, and the pressure is simply we don't let the pressure up, and we get the electorate mobilized around these issues more. The electorate doesn't really understand how these things are connected. They don't understand that mass immigration, for example, is connected to the fact we can't have a debate on immigration because of woke. They don't understand that crime and homelessness and all of these problems are connected to the culture war and woke. They think, oh, there's a culture war, it's happening on campus, it's just this little thing. And meanwhile, there's just the rest of the things that really matter. We need a politician that can connect the issues that are happening in the culture with these bread and butter, more immediate issues that voters care about.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I honestly I don't really see that in Canada. Um, you know, you've got Polyev going around talking about common sense issues, and he talks about economics, he talks about housing and
Yeah.
stuff. Okay, I'm not saying that's not important, but yeah, like I don't know how much he knows that like okay, we can't have an economics policy because you've got economists who think 2 plus 2 can equal 5.
Mhm.
It's like I don't think there are maybe there are some, but I don't think you know even okay, someone like Maxime Bernier from the People's Party, like I mean he doesn't have a shot, but I don't think he knows or he's being told by people like how pervasive this stuff is and how it's not just oh this is just about race. It's like no, it's a lens through which everything is looked at. So you can't have a fisheries policy unless you have a racial component to it. You
Yeah.
can't have a fisheries policy unless you have a gender-based plus analysis of it. Like like these
Yeah.
stupid
Yeah.
things. And it's so I don't think they understand that. But that's why, like I said, we need maybe someone to come in to put the brakes to it, and then you have grassroots organizations that are kind of driving policy because we're starting to build a few grassroots organizations in Canada, and then at least on the local and some on the provincial level, they're getting some traction. But I mean, it's still very early. But like I said, if we can have someone put the brakes on it federally, maybe we can start working on it at a lower level. Because I think you're going to need a mixture of, like I said, your book versus Helen's book. Helen's book is okay. How do you push back at your work, at your school? How do you push back against HR policies and stuff like that, which is at a very personal level, which people need. And yours is more of how do we fix it on a systemic level? And I think you need a mixture of the two because without that, it's going to be an incomplete fight, and there's still going to be. I don't want to sound like a complete authoritarian or totalitarian, like rooted out, like cut it out root and stem, but like you're you're going to have to do a good job of getting rid of the vestiges of that stuff that's in our systems.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There was this whole tactic question. Now, so I think this is really a both and issue because it's a
Mm,
complex system. You have to attack it everywhere.
mm,
So that means you've got to do politics and got to reform institutions by electing governments and getting them focused on culture wars as an issue. You have to raise the salience or the priority of the culture war for voters. You have to mobilize locally, provincially, and one way, at least in the US, that they do is they set up these kind of, they're called 401c4s, which are these essentially fundraising organizations that solicit donations, channel them to the grassroots group, report on the success of the grassroots movements back to the donors. And some of these have got, billions of dollars in terms of funds that they're raising and funneling to. And that just simply fires up the organization of these grassroots movements. So that's going to do the grassroots. And we have to also have to win the battle of ideas because ultimately, I think what's behind this, and I try and mention that in the book, is we need something like a Cold War where people understand what the opposite of equity is. So economic equity is communism,
mm.
and they understand that communism stifles economic growth, and we can do some redistribution, but we're going to have a free market economic growth. On the cultural side, with left liberalism, there's no guardrails to the left. It's just, no, we must have gender equality, we must have race equity. I mean, nothing less is acceptable because obviously people are naturally equal. It's not a question about people's genetics. This is a question about the fact that, there are cultural differences. Groups arrive at different times in a country, they live in different places, different median ages. We all know that there are a whole bunch of reasons why they have different preferences. South Asians are going to want to be in medicine, not sociology more. Then we're going to have a different mix there. Simply allowing for this mix to express itself and that there is not going to be perfect equality. It's really tough for a lot of left liberals to grasp. So we're going to need to have sort of, again, this Cold War where the equity side is completely dominant. We have a kind of communism going on. When I say communism, just complete equality is the goal of the system, and that's what it's seeking to optimize. We need to sort of have the alternative, which would be equivalent to the free world alternative to communism, which I call human flourishing, which says, equality is important, but it's one value amongst like 10. And we've also got truth and beauty and excellence and community or national cohesion and all of these other things, which are very important values and to making the good society. So we need a balance between we need an optimal amount of equity, not a maximal amount of equity. So we're going to go for a certain amount, but not a maximal amount. So this is the idea of human flourishing as against cultural socialism. Cultural wealth as against cultural socialism. That post-woke vision of kind of a Cold War for cultural wealth. We need to fight that and somehow get that rooted as a label that people can stick on whenever they see the cultural socialist arguments, the equity argument, boom, that's cultural socialism. I stand for human flourishing. Whenever you hear an argument around, oh, we have to be, hypersensitive and therefore we need a speech code, boom, that's cultural socialism. We prefer human flourishing and cultural wealth. That's the kind of automatic kind of political communication we need to be able to develop and get a generation coming through that can see these arguments and start to take a more questioning approach to the indoctrination that they're getting in school and in official culture.
Okay, yeah, I know. I agree with that. Um, okay, there's one thing that's I just want to get your kind of opinion on this. Now, I know I mentioned overcorrections at the kind of start. When I say that, like I said, if you look at the younger generations who say they want more government, monitoring and more government looking, like that's what I mean is like an overcorrection. Or if you want to look at some small policy things, um, Texas, they actually removed cynical theories from schools because they said, "Oh, this discusses critical race theory." So that was an overcorrection. Someone who wasn't paying attention to what was going on, they just blanket, "Oh, it mentions critical race theory, take it out." Like things like that.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, when you're fishing, you'll get some other stuff caught in the
Uh,
net, right? So I kind of like I'm thinking if I have to take critical race theory with Helen Pluckrose included, or an outright ban on critical race theory, and that catches Helen Pluckrose at the K-12 level, I'll take the ban. And
uh,
I know in the ideal, of course, in the ideal, we would have an teacher teaching evenly, teaching the DEI, critical race theory, and Glenn Lowry and Helen Pluckrose evenly and giving a fair fight between these proponents.
okay.
I just don't think that's realistic. I
Yeah, yeah,
just,
yeah.
given
No,
who we
no.
have in the teaching profession.
Yeah, okay. That I go. I make a point, but I was just laying that because what I keep seeing, and I equate this again to Islam. Like I equate some of this stuff to Islam just because that's how I got into this whole sphere was discussing Islam. And um, it's the arguments about how other people are fighting back. And I know I'm kind of doing that right now, but it's uh, Ayan Hirsi Ali just recently wrote an article about how pervasive wokeism is. It's like one of the biggest threats to civilization, whatever. And then Kathy Young rebutted it, said, "No, no, you're forgetting about everything coming from the right." And I don't want to pick on Kathy, but I've seen her do it a couple of times where she's critiquing the way other people are taking on the woke, which I saw that with Islam. And the people who were the most effective were the people who just focused on, okay, this is why I oppose Islam. This is what I'm against it. So people like Gusmi Muhammad or Sarah Hayter, if you look at them as opposed to some other people, Reza Aslan or whatever, they were focused on, oh, well, see how Sam Harris is discussing Islam. That's the wrong way to do it. Like that's what they were talking about. And I see a lot of that with the woke. And then there's always, oh, well, you got to worry about the right wing. And I mean, I saw it with a lot of um, academics. I could list off names, and I don't like doing it because I don't want to like seem like I'm picking on
Mm,
someone. That's why, like I said, I'm not trying to pick on Kathy there. But
yeah.
who would like academics who would, as soon as like Ron DeSantis did something like the Stop Woke Act and stuff like that, oh my God, academic freedom, you're taking away. It's like, where were you for the last 30 years when it was being whittled away? And so that's what I'm kind of getting at. Like this, I don't want to say don't worry about anything from the right because it's all, you know, chocolates and sunshine, but it's, there, but the bigger problem again is the woke left.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's got all the power in all the institutions. You might have one-offs here or there where, oh, look at this great op-ed from the New York Times. Things are turning around. Like, give me a break. Like, it's just.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I generally would be more on the Rufo camp in a lot of ways, but I take a somewhat more benign view in that, yes, I think that, these people are obviously trying to burnish, Kathy might be trying to burnish her anti-Republican credentials to say, hey, I'm one of you guys. I'm like like you, I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal. And so here's me showing that by criticizing the anti-woke side. Now, I guess my view on this, however, is that I think there's actually a role for both. I mean, I think there's a role for people telling it like it is, if you like, and essentially, and also advocating for the kind of government intervention measures that I support, like the DeSantis style. Not all of the DeSantis mission, but certainly as regards K to 12 for the most part. Um, Now, I think there's also a role for these kind of people who want to show that they're inside the liberal democratic tent, the liberal tent or the left tent, but they're critics of woke because they are going to be. I mean, they have a better chance at persuading the sensible people on their own side. Now, I don't think persuasion on its own is going to do it. It's just impossible. But I think the way I see change happening is conservatives put pressure, and that pressure leads the sections of the left that are the least woke to be able to have a bit more power. So it gives them a bit more leverage against the loonies. And so that we have both of these things happening. But the pressure begins with the conservatives. So you can see, for example, with removing DEI statement or diversity statements, it starts with red states banning it. You then get pressure from the Republicans federally. The political pressure from the right gets the center left to say to the radicals, look, you guys, come on. I mean, if we don't reform, they're coming for us. Or for example, you lose an election because, like in Virginia, you want to tell parents that teachers get to decide what's taught. Okay, that then becomes an election mantra. You lose on it. Or you lose because you're in favor of critical race theory. Once you start to lose elections as a Democrat, that centrist, non-woke or relatively non-woke Democrat can start to gain the upper hand. So the James Carvilles and David Shores can gain the upper hand against the loonies. And that's what I mean is the change will come from the right, but there is also a role for that kind of center leftist who can kind of critique the right, but at the same time, more or less carry out a lot of the aims of reformers from the right and push them into the institutions. So they became mainstream, as we see in MIT and Harvard getting rid of diversity statements. Yes, they've got a long way to go, but it's something. So I see a process of change, starting, again, that's a good analogy, red state bans on DEI leading to, through a certain process of influence, even within blue state elite institutions, enacting some of this agenda. So I think there is a role there's this sort of mixed economy role, but that doesn't mean that I agree with everything Kathy Young's saying. Certainly not.
Yeah, I know. Like I said, I didn't want to, just single her out. I just was using her as
Yeah,
an example of, that this kind of thing where, oh well, you're not critiquing it right, and you should be doing. And Kathy has done her own critiques of woke stuff. I'm not saying that's her only raison d'être, in this
yeah,
whole fight. It's just I'm not saying that. It just, but there are some people that's all they do, and there are some people, like I said, with Islam, that's all they did. And I just, you know, yes, let's keep an eye on it. You know, let's make sure. Okay, an example was in Australia. I think it was a Let Women Speak event, and you did have a bunch of neo Nazis show up on the same side as them, but there was physical separation between the groups. Two groups weren't associated. Um, you can have that kind of stuff. There was the same thing in Canada. I was speaking to some of the parents and I was speaking to some of the organizers. I said, if you are going to have, because there was this Islam alliance with the parents, and there was a bunch of Muslim groups, and that only lasted until October 7th. But
right,
anyways, we can,
right,
but there was this thing with the parents groups, and I warned them. I said, look, if you're gonna have protests and you're having, I don't know the Muslims, I don't know the Muslim groups, I don't know these people, but I said just make it very clear that your protest is about this, protecting the kids. Your protest is not anti anything. Your protest is just we're protecting the kids and we're against our kids being indoctrinated, and that's it. And focus on that. Because again, like I didn't want that far right thing like of okay, I'm not equating Muslim parents to neo
yeah, yeah,
Nazis, but you do like Islam is not famously tolerant of LGBTQ,
right, right,
like
right,
um
yeah,
so yeah, that's why I was trying to get the parents like just take as many allies as you want, you know, get as broad a tent as you want, but be very, very specific on what you're protesting and what you're not protesting. You know,
yeah. I think that makes really good sense. And of course, you can get extreme elements in any movement, um, but I'm not that. At this point, of course, sometime in the future, of course there could be a risk of far right, but I think at this point, I think that's an alarmist, that's kind of catastrophizing narrative to shut down the critique for the most part. I just think, the cultural left has essentially all the power in these institutions. Their strategy is really to deflect and minimize and keep this under the radar. And so they don't actually have to do much. They're at the top of the hill. People like us are at the bottom of the hill. We have to expose ourselves to enemy fire. We have to politicize this issue. They can say, "You're stoking the culture war." And essentially, even obviously Trudeau's been aggressively woke even in his policies, but he doesn't even necessarily have to do that. In Britain, we're going to have a Labour government under Keir Starmer. They're probably not going to do so many things overtly legislatively, but what they will do is simply take the pressure off. Not that the Tories did much, but they at least put the wokesters on notice, the social justice activists inside institutions on a bit of notice that they were not going to have an open season. Now, so essentially the left politically only needs to do nothing for there to be the cultural revolution, whereas the right actually has to politicize this issue. So the political left, their goal is really to say, you're stoking a culture war. This is divisive. People care about putting food on the table. That's the sort of way they will try and deflect any sort of cultural politics. Whereas what the right needs to do, actually, conservatives need to do, is actually constantly push these issues up the agenda all the time. Use very vivid images. In Scotland, the image of a tattooed male rapist going into a women's prison is really what swung things. And the right is going to have to get better at wielding these very powerful images, because a lot of people don't get it. They do understand a mastectomy, a teenage girl with breast cut off, the graphic, people will get that. They don't necessarily understand all these debates around transgender rights, gender affirming care versus, and all the complexities around that. So part of the political strategy has to be to try and cut through to people with limited attention spans, to show vivid images that speak 1,000 words, to get buzzwords and catchphrases like critical race theory and DEI and Toxify, as Rufo has done in the US. And that is a war of political communications and heuristics that are shortcuts for people to understand complex issues. And this is really the battle that we're having, is the public is on our side. If you actually do the research with public opinion, it's very clear they're on our side, at least for now. I mean, young people, that's a different question, but somehow finding a way to unlock and make this an issue politically. I think that's a key to how this plays out going forward, is will we have a leader? As in Britain, if you look at the Brexit referendum, you had Nigel Farage. He managed to get the European Union, an issue that no one cared about. That became a very big issue for people because Farage tied it to the issue they cared about, immigration. Well, similarly, I think in Canada, if you can tie, as you should, the issue of the culture wars, free speech and attacks on the national past, if you can tie those into problems around educational standards falling, lack of control, mass immigration, crime rising, the homelessness problem, pressure on public services and housing, all of this stuff. We can't address any of this because woke is in control of our culture and is able to shut down these debates and is only allowing one point of view in. Someone needs to be able to get that point across and make this a campaign slogan, like, it's all about woke in the culture war. This is not just on campus. The more we can raise that as an issue, it's been done in Virginia, it's been done briefly in Scotland, and has made a big difference. You've got to make the left pay for holding this unpopular view. They know it's unpopular, so they're trying to keep it under the radar. We've got to keep pushing it out into the open and politicizing it wherever we can. And by the way, politicizing the institutions, and what I mean by that is we want them to be neutral, but to make them neutral, we're going to have a political fight. That's true, for example, with court appointments. It's true about teacher education. It's true about every institution in civil service. I just think we're at the beginning of this process. In the US, the red states are very much in the lead here. They've only been doing this for 1 or 2 years. And so I think Canada will ultimately, or at least the right, is going to have to follow. Now, where's the pressure going to come from? I think that the grassroots members of the Conservative Party, and if it's not them, it'll be eventually maybe the PPC. The typical pattern is that a third party, right now in Britain, Reform under Nigel Farage might unseat the Conservatives as the leading force on the right, because the Conservatives essentially broke their campaign promises around immigration and around essentially trimming back the woke apparatus. That's if Poilievre does nothing and just wants to talk about inflation. And then I think there's a role for either the PPC or a grassroots splinter movement within the Conservative Party to sort of really put pressure, really show their discontent. And then if it has to be a third party movement, if you get the PPC on 10-12%, then suddenly the Conservatives are going to wake up and notice. Similarly, at the provincial level, if you had a splinter movement that was costing the Doug Ford style, which is really more or less a left liberal party, if you had on culture, if you had a new splinter group that cost them the election, they would then have to take notice. And that's kind of where change could come from.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this election in Canada, the next one, whenever it is between now and next October, uh, we have to get the Liberals out just because of all their laws and their policies. Like I just, but if we went, but like 2019, so the 2015 election and the 2019 election, I spoiled my ballot. There was no one. Okay, we vote for the MP in our riding, right? Like it's, we don't vote for prime minister, but we've taken that American style politics on where you're looking at the leader. But I mean, I'd spoil my ballot. I said, there's no one in my riding I like, and I don't trust any of the parties, so that's it. But 2021 and this year, it's just in 2019 and then in 2021, or was it 2020? I forget now. They had in their platforms, the Liberals and the NDP had censorship in their platforms. And in 2019, they had it, and they were going towards it. But they call that snap election. They couldn't get the policies through, and I was like, no,
Yeah.
I have to vote against this. I'll vote conservative, even though I knew I live in Outremont in Montreal. I mean, that's pretty much a liberal stronghold. Like
Right, right.
but I'm like, I'm still going to vote my conscience. But that's one thing I said, at least in 2015 and 2019, was spoil your ballot. If you don't like anyone, don't vote for the lesser of two
Yeah.
evils. If enough people spoil their ballots, I said even if you got like 5 to 10% to spoil their ballot, and it was a close election, the parties would take notice.
But I think it's not the same because you don't know why people spoil their ballot. Whereas if you get, if you actually get a populist party, a third party,
Yeah,
then that sends a very big signal. There's no question that reform is sending a major signal. And I'm just seeing the results coming in for the European elections, which of course the populist right is winning record levels and the left is doing about as bad, probably as badly as they ever have in history. So I mean, these are signal. Now the European elections don't matter for national elections, but they send a signal. And so I think voting for a third party is just more effective in making change. Now, the other way to do it is an internal factional fight within a party, but that presumes that you've got an alternative leader of a faction that is suitably charismatic to be a credible alternative leader. So you can do it internally or do it externally or a combination of both. I think in Britain, for example, the success of the Reform Party is going to embolden the more national conservative faction within the Conservative Party to say, look, we're the only future for the Conservatives. You liberal conservatives are not the future. So you can have this kind of triangulation, and I think that is probably how the change is going to have to happen. But it's only going to happen if voters are informed and want it to happen and are able to sort of put the pressure and vote for the right people, which
yeah,
is far from a given. Far from a given.
yeah. I don't know. Okay, I agree with you there. But like I said, the only reason I said spoiler ballot was back in 2015 and in 2019 there wasn't really a third party option.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so it was my thing was you're getting off your ass to actually go vote, but you're spoiling your ballot, so your vote's up for grabs. That's where my thinking was. Look, I don't want to keep you too much longer. It's if you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, where they can get your book, and I'll put like all the links in the description. And thank you very much again for coming back on.
Thanks a lot, Abate. It's always a great conversation, and you're a great warrior
Mm.
for sanity. So I always love this podcast and always have great chats. So keep up the great work. Yeah, I mean the book is The Third Awokening. You can get that on Amazon. Um, and if you go to my website, www.sneps.net, you can find the links to that. My course is that, as well, you can check out my course on woke at the University of Buckingham. It's an open online course. So please do both of those things. Check those out. I'm on Twitter, of course, at EPKaufm, EPKAUFM. So thanks very much, Obaid.
Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for listening.